Okay, so picture this. It is 1812. You are the United States of America. You are like 30-something years old as a country, basically a college sophomore who just moved out of Britain's house, still figuring out how to do your own laundry, and already getting into bar fights. And here's the thing, you didn't even start this fight. You were just standing there minding your own business, trying to trade cotton and tobacco with literally anyone who'll take it, and suddenly you are caught in the middle of the biggest, messiest, most petty geopolitical breakup in European history. Britain and France are going at each other's throats again, because apparently that is just their thing, and you, the brand new kid on the block, keep getting clipped by the punches meant for the other guy. The British are out on the open ocean straight up, kidnapping American sailors, not metaphorically, like actual human beings, grabbed off American ships, thrown into the Royal Navy, and told, "Congratulations, you work for us now." They called it impressment, which has got to be the most polite word ever invented for what is essentially government-sponsored piracy. And if that wasn't enough, Britain is also quietly arming and encouraging Native American tribes along the frontier to push back against American expansion. So you've got kidnapping on the seas, chaos on the frontier, and a Congress full of guys who are absolutely done with all of it. This is the setup. This is the energy. Welcome to the War of 1812, America's most chaotic, most confusing, most accidentally funny conflict where the White House got burned down. The National Anthem was born on a boat, and someone fought a major battle 2 weeks after the war ended. But before we get into all of that, before we talk about how the most powerful military in the world set fire to a building and then got completely embarrassed at a mud fort in Louisiana, let's do the thing. Welcome to Sketchy Past. If you like your history fast, funny, and slightly unhinged, hit that subscribe button right now and join the Sketchy Empire. We are on a mission to hit 100,000 subscribers, and honestly, you are the reinforcement we didn't know we needed. Think of yourself as the Oliver Hazard Perry of this channel. We'll explain that reference later, and it is going to slap all right. Let's get into it. So let's back up and actually talk about why this war happened, because it doesn't just come out of nowhere. There is a whole slow burn buildup of grievances, ego, and what can only be described as British audacity first. You've got the impressment thing between 1793 and 1812. The Royal Navy impressed somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 American sailors. 10,000, these are guys who were born in America, working American ships, living American lives. And Britain essentially said, nah, we need bodies for our Navy, and you speak English, so you are ours. The argument they used was that if you were born British before American independence, you were still British in their eyes. Didn't matter if you had an American passport. Didn't matter if you'd lived in the States your whole life. You had an English accent. Congratulations. You are impressed. This is, to put it mildly, insane. Then you've got the Orders in Council, British trade restrictions that were essentially blocking America from doing business with France. Remember, Napoleon's running around Europe at this point, doing Napoleon things, and Britain wants everyone to choose a side. America, very reasonably, wants to trade with both sides and make money, because that is kind of the whole point of being a neutral country. Britain says absolutely not. France says something similar, but slightly less aggressively. America gets squeezed from both sides and starts losing serious money. And then there is the frontier situation. Tecumseh, one of the most brilliant Native American leaders in history, was building a confederacy of tribes to resist American expansion into the Northwest Territory, which, from his perspective, makes complete sense. America was taking land that wasn't theirs to take. But the Americans looked at this resistance movement and immediately went, Britain is behind this, because Britain was in fact providing support and weapons. The Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where William Henry Harrison crushed Tecumseh's brothers' forces at Prophetstown, only hardened American suspicion that Britain was actively working against them on their own soil. So by 1812, you've got a country that is fed up. Years of kidnapped sailors, blocked trade, and what feels like a foreign power stirring trouble in your own backyard, and into this powder keg walks President James Madison. Now James Madison is a fascinating guy. He is the father of the Constitution, the principal architect of the Bill of Rights, one of the most intellectually formidable political minds in American history, and also, at 5 feet 4 inches, the tiniest president the United States has ever had. We're not going to make a big deal about that. We're just going to note it and move on. Madison had a group of allies in Congress known as the War Hawks, younger representatives, mostly from the South and the West, who were aggressively pro-war, guys like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. These dudes were fired up. They wanted to defend American honor, stop the impressment, push Britain out of Canadian-based meddling, and this is the part that gets a little wild, potentially annex Canada. Yais, the plan was to invade Canada. Thomas Jefferson, former president, founding father guy who literally wrote that all men are created equal while owning slaves. So we know his record on predicting things correctly is mixed. Thomas Jefferson said, with full confidence, that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Reader, it was not. The U.S. tried to invade Canada multiple times in 1812 and 1813, and each attempt was more embarrassing than the last. The strategy, if you can even call it that, was essentially to hit Canada from multiple angles simultaneously and overwhelm the British-Canadian defenses before they could respond. What actually happened was a masterclass in military incompetence. The first major invasion attempt was led by General William Hull, who marched into Upper Canada from Detroit in July 1812 with around 2,200 men and all the confidence of someone who had never actually fought anyone. Within weeks, he retreated back across the border, then surrendered Fort Detroit without a fight to a British force that was actually smaller than his own. He genuinely got tricked into thinking the British had way more Native American allies than they did, panicked, and handed over one of the most strategically important forts on the frontier. He was later court-martialed and sentenced to death for cowardice. Madison pardoned him because he was old and had fought in the Revolution. But still, not a great start. The other invasion attempts didn't go much better. The Battle of Queenston Heights saw American forces actually cross into Canada, only to get pushed back partly because New York militiamen flat out refused to cross the border, citing a law that said they couldn't be forced to serve outside U.S. territory in the middle of a battle that they were supposed to be supporting. Imagine showing up to help someone move, and then when they actually need you to carry a box, you go, "Actually, I checked the lease, and I am only responsible for the common areas." Canada did not fall. Canada was, if anything, annoyed and slightly insulted by the whole thing. Okay, so if the Canadian invasion was the lowlight of American military planning in this war, then what happened in the summer of 1814 was the rock bottom. By 1814, Napoleon had been defeated and exiled to Elba, which meant Britain suddenly had a lot of very experienced, very hardened soldiers with nothing to do. So they did what anyone does when they have a bunch of fired-up veterans sitting around. They pointed them at America and said, "Go cause problems." And cause problems they did. In August of 1814, a British expeditionary force of about 4,500 soldiers under General Robert Ross landed in Maryland and started marching toward Washington, D.C. The American response was, let's say, disorganized. Secretary of War John Armstrong genuinely didn't believe the British would target the capital. He thought Baltimore was the real objective, and basically refused to prepare proper defenses until it was embarrassingly obviously too late. The Battle of Bladensburg, fought just outside Washington, was so one-sided that historians have affectionately nicknamed it the Bladensburg Races, because the American militia broke and ran so fast that it wasn't really a battle so much as a very panicked foot race in the wrong direction. President Madison himself was on the battlefield watching this disaster unfold, which is both remarkable and kind of heartbreaking. The road to Washington was open. The British marched into the capital of the United States, a city that had existed for less than 15 years, and proceeded to do something no foreign power had done since the Revolution. They torched it. The Capitol building burned, the Treasury burned, various government offices burned, and then, in the single most symbolically devastating act of the entire war, they walked into the president's house, the White House, found a dining table set for 40 guests with food still on it. Madison had expected to be hosting a victory dinner that evening that did not age well, sat down, ate the food, had a civilized meal in the home of their enemy, and then lit the whole thing on fire. There is something almost darkly comedic about that sequence of events, the audacity, the pettiness. Historians debate whether the dinner eating part is entirely accurate, but honestly it feels true in spirit. Now here is where we have to talk about someone who absolutely does not get enough credit in mainstream history education, Dolley Madison, while the president and the government were scrambling out of the city. First Lady Dolley Madison was at the White House, refusing to leave until she'd done something important. She didn't grab the silverware, she didn't grab money, she didn't grab her personal belongings. She grabbed a full-length portrait of George Washington. The painting, attributed to Gilbert Stuart, was attached to the wall, and Dolley reportedly had the frame broken and the canvas removed so it could be taken safely, in the middle of a military invasion, while the British were literally marching toward the building. She then climbed into a carriage, portrait in hand, and got out of there. That is the energy. That is the entire vibe. Your house is being invaded by a foreign military, and your first thought is, I need to save the portrait of the founding father. Dolley Madison understood the assignment in a way that basically no one else in that entire situation did. The British occupation of Washington lasted about 26 hours. A massive thunderstorm, possibly a tornado, rolled through the city the next day, causing enough chaos and damage to the British forces that they decided to withdraw. Some historians note the storm may have done more damage to British equipment than the Americans managed. Make of that what you will. While Washington was still smoldering, the British set their sights on Baltimore, which, unlike the capital, was actually defended. Baltimore had prepared. They'd sunk ships in the harbor to block the British fleet. They'd fortified Fort McHenry at the entrance to the harbor. They had actual troops. It was compared to Bladensburg, an almost shockingly competent military operation. The British bombardment of Fort McHenry began on the 13th of September, 1814, and lasted about 25 hours. Somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 shells were fired at the fort. The fort fired back. Nobody moved. At the end of it all, Fort McHenry was still standing, the American flag was still flying, and the British decided to call it a day and sail away. But here is the thing that makes this moment historically significant beyond just a defensive victory. There was a 35-year-old American lawyer named Francis Scott Key who had been detained on a British ship during the bombardment. He'd gone out to negotiate the release of a captured American doctor, and the British kept him on board so he couldn't report on their military positions. So he spent the entire night watching the bombardment from the deck of an enemy ship, not knowing whether Fort McHenry would survive. And when morning broke, when the smoke cleared enough to see through, the flag was still there, the big flag, the 30 by -42 foot garrison flag flying above the fort. Keki was so moved by this that he pulled out a letter from his pocket and started writing on the back of it. That poem became Defense of Fort McHenry, which got set to the tune of a popular British drinking song, because apparently all the best American patriotic music is actually repurposed British content, and eventually in 1931 became the official national anthem of the United States. So the next time you are standing at a baseball game, hand over heart, watching someone struggle through the high notes, just remember, that song was written by a lawyer, on the back of a letter, on a British boat, after watching a 25-hour artillery bombardment in the middle of the night. It has got context. Now, while all of this is happening on land, there is a whole separate legend being built on the water, and it involves one of the most beloved ships in American naval history, the USS Constitution. The Constitution, a 44-gun heavy frigate launched in 1797, had already had a good war by this point, winning multiple engagements against British warships in 1812 and 1813. But the moment that gave her the nickname that stuck forever happened during a battle with HMS Gary Fair in August 1812. The British ship opened fire. The cannonballs hit the Constitution's thick oak hull. She was built from live oak, one of the hardest and most durable woods in North America, and bounced off, just deflected right off the side. An American sailor watching this happen in real time reportedly shouted something along the lines of, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron." And that was it. From that day forward, she was Old Ironsides. The Constitution went on to win that battle, decisively capturing and burning the Gary Ferry. She went on to win more engagements. And today, she is still afloat in Boston Harbor, the oldest commissioned naval vessel in the world, because in 1830, when the Navy proposed scrapping her, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a poem about it that caused such a public outcry that they refurbished her instead. A poem saved a warship. That is just a beautiful sentence. Let's talk about Oliver Hazard Perry, because this guy genuinely deserves a movie. It is September 1813. The Battle of Lake Erie. Perry is commanding a small American fleet against a British squadron on the lake, and things go sideways almost immediately. His flagship, the Lawrence, named after the captain who died saying, "Don't give up the ship," which Perry had embroidered on a battle flag, takes devastating fire. The Lawrence is shot to pieces. Most of her crew are dead or wounded. The ship is essentially done. At this point, most people would either surrender or accept defeat. Perry looked at this situation and said, absolutely not. He grabbed his battle flag, the one that said, "Don't give up the ship," got into a rowboat, and rowed through active cannon fire to another ship, the Niagara. He then took command of the Niagara, turned the entire battle around, and sent one of the most iconic dispatches in American military history back to General William Henry Harrison. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." 9 words, clean, confident, no elaboration needed. That is how you write a battlefield report. The victory at Lake Erie was genuinely significant. It gave the Americans control of the lake, cut British supply lines, and forced British and Native American forces to withdraw from the Detroit region. It is not just a good story, it actually mattered strategically. Now we jump forward to January 1815 and we arrive at the Battle of New Orleans, which is, depending on how you look at it, either the most glorious victory in American military history or the most absurd story in the entire war. By this point, Andrew Jackson has arrived on the scene. Jackson, future president, notorious for being absolutely unhinged in the most productive possible way, had already made a name for himself fighting in the Creek War. Now he is in New Orleans, trying to defend the city from a major British assault. His army was a patchwork coalition that could only have happened in 1815 New Orleans. He had regular U.S. Army soldiers. He had Tennessee and Kentucky militiamen. He had free black soldiers, the Battalion of Free Men of Color, who fought with distinction. He had Choctaw warriors. He had a contingent of Louisiana Creoles, and he had pirates. Specifically, the crew of the privateer Jean Lafitte, who had previously been offered a pardon by the British, and turned it down to fight for America instead. Andrew Jackson built his defensive line behind earthworks and cotton bales, positioned his forces brilliantly, and waited. The British, under General Edward Pakenham, launched a frontal assault on the 8th of January 1815 it was, and there is no gentle way to say this, a catastrophe for the British. Pakenham had somewhere around 8,000 experienced soldiers, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers who had fought under Wellington, some of the best fighting men in the world. Jackson had about 4,700 men behind fortifications. In roughly 30 minutes of actual fighting, the British suffered somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 casualties. The Americans lost fewer than 100. Pakenham was killed. His second, in command, was killed. Multiple senior officers were cut down. The British assault disintegrated. It was one of the most lopsided American military victories in history. There was just one tiny problem. The war had ended 2 weeks earlier. On the 24th of December 1814, 2 weeks before Jackson's men were loading their rifles at the British, American, and British diplomats in the Belgian city of Ghent, had signed the Treaty of Ghent, formally ending the War of 1812. Both sides agreed to go back to the way things were before the war, return the territory, release the prisoners. Shake hands, go home. But news in 1815 traveled at the speed of a sailing ship, which meant the treaty had to physically cross the Atlantic Ocean before anyone in America knew it existed. No telegraph, no telephone, no internet, no email sitting in anyone's drafts folder. Just a document on a boat somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, while two armies were actively fighting each other in Louisiana. By the time the treaty was officially ratified by the United States Senate on the 17th of February, 1815, Andrew Jackson had already become a national hero. The Battle of New Orleans had already been fought. And the political consequences of that victory, the way it transformed Jackson's reputation and eventually launched him to the presidency, were already in motion. History had already been made based on a war that was technically over. So what actually happened when the dust settled? The Treaty of Ghent's status quo, ante bellum, as the diplomats put it, which is Latin for let's all agree to just pretend this never happened, restored everything to the way it was before the war. No territorial changes, no reparations, no major concessions from either side. Britain didn't stop impressment outright in the treaty, but the end of the Napoleonic Wars made the whole issue moot. They didn't need to impress sailors anymore. America didn't get Canada. Canada didn't want to be gotten. On paper, it looks like nobody won. And in a strict military and diplomatic sense, that is pretty accurate. But here's the thing about the War of 1812. Its real significance is less about what changed on maps and more about what changed in American identity. The war marked the final collapse of the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and flirted with the idea of New England secession during the Hartford Convention. When the war ended with an American victory at New Orleans, even if that victory was technically unnecessary, the Federalists were politically toast. They were seen as unpatriotic, out of touch, and obstructionist, and they never recovered. The period that followed is literally called the era of good feelings, because for a brief moment, American domestic politics calmed down to the point where there was essentially one functional political party that never happened before or since. Cherish it. More broadly, the war did something genuinely important for American national confidence. The U.S. had gone to war with the most powerful naval empire in the world and survived. Washington had burned, yes, and that stung badly, but Fort McHenry had held, old Ironsides had bounced cannonballs, Perry had carried a flag through cannon fire and turned a battle around. Jackson had turned a mud rampart into a killing field. These were stories that became mythology, the kind of national mythology that young countries desperately need to develop a sense of shared identity. Britain, for its part, came away with a new respect for American stubbornness. Conquering the United States had seemed, before the war, like it might be achievable if they really committed to it. After the war, the general British consensus shifted toward something like, these people are more trouble than they're worth, and also Canada is fine, and we should just agree to get along. The Rush-Bagot Agreement in 1817 demilitarized the Great Lakes border between the U.S. and Canada, a border that has remained peaceful ever since. That is actually a remarkable achievement, even if nobody talks about it, and Native Americans, they paid the highest price of anyone in this conflict. Tecumseh died at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. His Confederacy collapsed without him. The hope of a unified Native American resistance to westward expansion effectively died with him, and the decades that followed brought Indian removal, forced displacement, and the destruction of tribal nations that had existed for centuries. The War of 1812 is sometimes called the last real chance Native Americans had to resist American expansion, and it is impossible to tell the full story of this war without acknowledging that the Good Feelings era was built, in significant part, on the wreckage of that defeat. But in the pop history YouTube-friendly version of events, in the version where we're trying to make sense of this messy, contradictory, accidentally funny conflict, what you are left with is this. America picked a fight it wasn't ready for, got humiliated in Canada, had its capital burned by people who ate the president's dinner first, wrote a national anthem on the back of a letter while watching an artillery bombardment from a British boat, won a decisive battle after the peace treaty was signed, and came out of the whole thing feeling great about itself. That is not a logical outcome. That is not how stories are supposed to work. But that is history messy, chaotic, and somehow, against all the odds, kind of magnificent. The White House needed a serious paint job. The Federalists needed to reconsider their career choices, and America, for better or worse, had officially arrived. That was the War of 1812, America's most confusing, most chaotic, most accidentally triumphant conflict. Part naval drama, part military disaster, part origin story for half the symbols we still use today. The anthem, Old Ironsides, the burned and rebuilt White House. All of it traces back to this bizarre, underrated war. If you made it to the end of this video, first of all, thank you. You are the kind of person who actually wants to understand history, not just hear one good anecdote and call it a day. Second of all, you clearly have excellent taste, so go ahead and smash that like button, ring the bell so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Sketchy Past and join the Empire. Or next episode, we're taking on Napoleon Bonaparte, and specifically the extremely persistent myth about his height, where it came from, what it says about propaganda, and what he was actually like in person. Spoiler. The answer is complicated, fascinating, and involves the British being petty again. Shocking, I know. Stay curious, stay sketchy, and I'll see you in the next one.